Dr. Morrell is someone whose work I greatly respect, and if you want to know more about critical theory, he would be someone that I would recommend that you look at, including also Ian Rowe out of American Enterprise Institute. Both of them have been doing work on critical race theory, and I love what he says right here. This is the right way to think, or else it's not education. So, okay. Basically, how did I end up standing up here, which I never thought I'd be? Most of the time I spent in the classroom. I was in the classroom for 20 years. And one of the things that happened in my 20 years was that things started coming down into my classroom. And if you're a teacher, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Things started coming down into my classroom, and I didn't understand where it was coming from. However, because I am a student of history, particularly Soviet history, which caught my attention at a fairly young age, and so much so that when I went to college, I took Russian language while my other friends were taking Spanish and French. I just found that a fascinating language. And so when I started seeing some of the things coming down, both in education and in the world at large, it really, I'm not here to say the Bolsheviks are going to pop out of boxes or anything, but there are some similarities that are startling. And you heard Robbie talk about it, you heard Dr. Wu talk about the connection to Marxism. Now, if you look at Soviet education after the October Revolution and when Lenin and then Stalin, et cetera, started creating the education system, these are some of the things that they said, and if you're a teacher, you're going to recognize some of these. One of the things they said was that they needed to raise, improve, extend, and strengthen education, which was true because of the fact that most of the population at the time was illiterate, so they were indeed trying to improve education. Then they started talking about a stable curriculum that would be national and that would be taught from the same textbooks. Does that sound familiar? Kind of like Common Core. Same argument. Probably the one argument that was thrown at me most of the time when I fought Common Core was, if a person moves from Texas to Louisiana, then we'll all be on the same page. And I was like, do you really think that's going to be, we don't even start at the same time. I mean, Montana starts different from Louisiana. It's a ridiculous argument, and again, Common Core proponents push this idea of a stable or a national curriculum, lowering the age of compulsory attendance, hyper-focus on early childhood education, revising the curriculum to address social needs, decrease focus on history, workforce development. How many of you have heard that over and over in your schools? In Louisiana, starting in 8th grade, you had to fill out a goal sheet. You're an 8th grader, and you have to fill out 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and beyond what your goals are for life. I don't know an 8th grader yet that I taught that could tell you that. 5-year plan. The 5-year plan had metrics to it, and you were to meet those metrics or there will be some serious consequences. I heard this a lot, and I've heard it a lot in states like Tennessee before I moved here, where you have teachers being evaluated on a test that they can't see. And if they don't meet the metrics for that test, there will be consequences for that. Public shaming, etc. We see that here in the 5-year plan, where ultimately it would lead them to pass kids who were not doing well, who knew nothing, just so they didn't get in trouble with the 5-year plan. Removing teachers if they expressed any resistance, and silencing those who would dissent to what was going on. And I can tell you, as someone who fought Common Core with a lot of people in Louisiana, the one thing that we couldn't do is get teachers to speak up. And the reason we couldn't get them to speak up is because they were being threatened by their principals and by their superintendents. If they didn't show up, or if they did show up, they would be suddenly be evaluated. Suddenly the evaluations in their classrooms would begin to increase. And if you're a teacher, you know what that means. It means that they're looking to get rid of you. And so this, again, it looks very similar to what the Soviets did. Lowering expectations for the benefit of weaker students, called today leveling the playing field. Now, I want you to think about what leveling the playing field means. If you have a playing field and it's not level, How do you make it level? You shave off the parts that are what? That are higher. So when they talk about leveling the playing field, they are not talking about helping those kids who need help. If you wanted to help kids who needed help, you would quit making statewide mandates and target those areas that need the help. But what they do is they want the whole state to be under a specific kind of curriculum, or a specific this or a specific that, especially in Louisiana. Tennessee's a little bit different. Louisiana, from its inception, has been a top-down state. That's why it was so easy for the people who supported Common Core, like Bill Gates, Eli Broad, and all of them, to come into Louisiana because it was already a top-down state. Districts took their marching orders from the State Department of Education. Oh, they said they had local control, but in reality they did not. And ultimately the Soviets, the way in which they created their classrooms and their education system, there was a significant lack of respect for teachers and the teaching profession. And I know that she spoke that I went over to Japan. I was one of 50 people who were selected among the nation to go for a 2-week educational study, if you will, where I was allowed to go to elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. I even got to go to Toyota High School. They have a Toyota High School, which was really cool, by the way, very high tech. But it was teaching the kids of the parents who worked for Toyota how to begin to move into those positions. So they learned all about, they had a whole area where they would learn about painting cars, and how they would learn about exhaust and all of those things. And so as I was there, I was walking through an area, and a lady came up and asked my interpreter. She said, "Who is she?" Because I'm one of those kids y'all have in the classroom who wanders. Okay, I'm looking around at all of the things because I'm a history person, I'm looking at all the historical stuff. And this little old lady, and there's even a picture of us in the newspaper because it got submitted to the newspaper, but she's a little old lady, and she's bent over, and she comes up and she asked my translator, and she said, oh, she's a teacher from America, and the first thing that lady did was, sensei. I got more respect in a foreign country for my profession than I did in the one that I lived in. That should tell you something about the state of education. So these are the things that happened in the Soviet Union. These are the changes that began to happen, and you can see that they're very similar to what's going on here. So when we say that we're waving a little flag going, there's some problems here, that we're telling you that there's some problems here. And so I started looking at these things, and I began remembering the underlying philosophy behind this education system. And it's called Homo Sovieticus, the new Soviet man. It was an idea that in order to get the population to agree to this new regime, you had to change how they thought. And the way to do that was through education. So they began to change their education system to focus on psychological and didactical approaches. Didactical meaning that the lessons come, educational lessons came with a moral lesson, that they were teaching them something. And then they started talking about whether they had correct mental phenomenon, did they think right? And then this idea that they must be removed from their family, from the influence of their family. They need to remove them. They need to nationalize them. And one of the things that I hear often, especially from people like Mark Tucker, is that we need a national education system. You will hear that a lot. We need a national. Think about what would happen if they nationalized it. How far away would it be from you? All the decision making. And then they talked about the human relations, and I need you to really hone in on this bottom one, because this is going to be what you're going to see through the rest of this presentation. When they talk about social revolution, and please understand something, this is not hyperbole. If you look at what they say, they tell you they want a social revolution. And so what is it that makes up our social fabric is these 4 things: family, religion, historical memory, and language, and they become targets. And in the Soviet Union, they were targets, and those kids underwent psychological conditioning that still resonates today, even though the Soviet Union dissolved many years ago. Oh, but that's Soviet Union. That's old stuff. Well, let's look at America. John Dewey, somebody that I was required to study. And the funny thing about it was, they didn't give me the book. They gave me excerpts of John Dewey. So I didn't know. Look, I'm like some of these young teachers. I was going, yeah, good stuff. Sounds great. Until you start reading all of John Dewey, who said that the home and the church need to be overturned in their influence. We don't want the home and the church to have influence over these kids. They need to be, their individual abilities need to be pulled together into the collective, that they become socially conformed and adapted to the social and collective. By the way, that's not, again, hyperbole, because John Dewey was one of the writers of the Humanist Manifesto. Frederick Gates, someone who worked with some of the philanthropists of the time period, said, in our dreams we have limited resources, and the people yield themselves to perfect docility to our molding hands. If you go look at Russian history, one of the things that one of the education people said was that children were like wax in their hands. Do you see the similarities there? That they are molding children. Then you have the Commission on Social Studies, Harold Lasky. At the bottom, and stripped of its careful neutral phrases, I highlight that for a reason, because a lot of times, a lot of these initiatives that are being told to you, you'll get a pat on the head, and then they will say, oh, but don't you want your child to be nice? Don't you want your child to learn about slavery? Don't you, that kind of voice that you get when you go to visit someone. This is my profession, and I'll be honest with you, I don't recognize it today. I don't. Please understand, Lasky's not criticizing, by the way. He's praising the fact that this was an agenda for socialist America, which, by the way, led to a flood of textbooks. A few more items here. These are people who, again, this is all in America. This is not the Soviet Union. These are people, Harvard University, Dr. Chester here, that we need to use education to reorganize the thoughts, attitudes, and feelings of children. You've got the whole child philosophy from the 1950s, which is raising its head again in Tennessee, that we're going to focus on fixed beliefs, changing fixed beliefs. You have, oh, well, that's old stuff. Okay, the 2030 framework. This is the 2030 framework from the OECD. Skills, attitudes, and values that shape human behavior ought to be rethought, and we need to counter discriminatory behaviors picked up at school and in the family. Again, sounds just like when I started hearing this stuff, I'm like, I feel like I'm reading socialist history again. I feel like I'm reading the Soviet books again. This is America that they're talking about here. So what is it that's going on? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because Robbie and Dr. Wu, both of them covered this pretty well. Ultimately, I want you to understand something, is that CRT is part of the critical theory studies. And they gave you all that information. But what I want you to understand about that is that in critical theory, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's critical gender theory, critical feminist theory, postmodernism, the whole ism group, is a radical skepticism of meta-narratives. What does that mean? If you have an explanation for the world, they're skeptical of it. Now, scientists do that. They do it radically. In other words, they reject totally, without any cause, any thoughts that you have that are different from theirs, okay? The idea of critical theory is that you are constantly and relentlessly critical of whatever it is that you don't like. Constantly, relentlessly critical. Think about it. How much of this stuff is coming down over and over and over and over, and it just seems to be never ending. One day, I was reading the newspaper the other day, and yes, I still get a newspaper because I'm old. And in that newspaper, there was an article from a young man out of California who decided to write an article about how automatic soap dispensers are racist. Anything and everything. And I get what he's saying. I get it. If you're making the soap dispenser, you should be considering all this. But was it racist or was it thoughtless? There's a difference.
Very different.
The tenets of critical race theory, very quickly, I'm going to run through this. Racism is normal. It's everywhere, in everything, and it's baked into our DNA. We cannot escape it any way, shape, form. That's one of the tenets. Number two, you're not going to fight racism unless you get, especially if you're a white person, you're not going to fight racism unless you're going to have a personal gain from it. That's called convergence theory. So therefore, a white person is never righteous. They're always doing it for self-interest. Number four is anti-liberal, and they talk to you about that. It's anti-American, it's anti-Constitution, anti-Declaration of Independence, etc. The fourth one is the key, because that's where education falls. Fourth one is the key. Knowledge is socially constructed, and storytelling and narratives become the way in which knowledge is produced, not scientific method and reasoning. Now, understand what that means. It means if I tell you a story, how many of you have kids that told you stories? And I mean real stories. I mean, I had 4 boys, and everything in my house has been broken at one time or another. What do you think happens when I come in and something's broken? I'm going to get a story, but am I going to get the truth? The problem with postmodernism, critical theory, etc., is that there is no objective truth. That becomes very important to understanding what you're seeing in the classroom and how they're being taught. In their own words, now here's the thing. This particular book right here, I'd recommend you get it and read it, because this is what they're using in the colleges of education to educate teachers. It's used in multiple colleges. It shows up all over the place. And they tell you themselves in their own book that they base their work on critical theory. Remember, critical theory. A relentless look at problems continually. Continual, all the time. Do you really think you can solve problems if you always look at them all the time and complain about them all the time? You can't. You can't solve a problem unless you identify the problem and then identify solutions to that problem. That's the way, America's been. I mean, think about it. A lot of our discoveries, the discoveries in this country, were based on somebody looking at it going, I think I can do better. Or, I wonder how I can fix this problem. And then they do. That's not what critical race theory or postmodernism is about. It's about a relentless criticism of everything. Again, tells you in your own words. This is Sensoy and D'Angelo telling you in their own words that they use critical theory approach. Again, relentless criticism of everything. Now, the thing about this is this run right here. The action requires a commitment to ongoing and lifelong progress. We're not going to fix the problem. We're not going to fix it. Like, if we work on it right now, is it going to be fixed? No, they're telling you right now. It is relentless, ongoing criticism. In other words, if we, let's say we just say today, okay, yeah, we're going to do it. We'll do everything you want us to do. Will it get better? Why? Because they're always looking for a problem. Thank you. They're always looking for a problem. And by the way, diversity training, I read and looked at some work, is about a $10 billion industry now. So I think Mr. Starbucks said a little while ago that they're making a lot of money off of this. They're making bank on this, okay? Now, do you remember earlier I talked about the 4 things about the fabric of society? How do I get people to change? I'm going to take possession of the cultural production. Education, media, arts, language, and religion. And you'll see some of these, the first 2 come from Soviet. The main task of mass communication is the purposeful development and perfecting of the minds of all of its members, and rejecting anything else we don't want them to believe. The other is changing words changes realities. If you look at critical race theory in particular, they use words that are defined in our eyes differently in the way they define it. And so I worked in legislation a great bit. I would go to the legislature and harass them, essentially. They'd roll their eyes when I showed up, and most of my friends, they'd roll their eyes at them. We'd all show up in a little group, and they'd be like, here they come again. But one of the things that I noticed in all the legislation that we had to fight was the definitions, because the definitions controlled the rest of the bill. And that's the thing. They'll say critical race theory is one thing, and then tomorrow it's a little different, and then the next day it's a little different. And it's like a moving target. It's like a moving target. And I love Dr. Richard Feynman. He puts it so succinctly. I would rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned. That's where I'm at. That's where I'm at. So how does it show up in education? How does it manifest itself? Well, programs, and more programs. One of the things is social emotional learning. When Common Core came down the pike, having been in the classroom for 20 years, I can tell you I had seen more standards than I could shake a stick at. One of the things that they never answer the question of is, can you give me an independent body of research that shows that a set of standards is positively correlated to student achievement? Because there is no body of research. They really just can't. It's like a moving target with these standards. Standards in and of themselves don't increase student achievement. They just don't. There's too many other items, and so when you hyper-focus on that, you're leaving behind the other stuff. But when Common Core came down the pike, one of the things that I noticed about them was, number one, they were vague. They were jargon-riddled, like deliberately attempting to keep people from understanding it. I cannot tell you how many times that I talked to teachers during this time period where they had to go to a session to unpack a standard. You have to unpack a standard? Then rewrite it. Because if you have to unpack a standard, then you've done something to that standard that's a really, really bad or really stupid. I like one of the standards that I read in second grade, I think it was. And the standard was, at the end of the year, basically I'm going to take all the jargon out. At the end of the year, the students will be reading higher level books. And my response to that was, duh. I would hope so at the end of the year. One of my worst time in the legislature when someone had to hold my leg down was when a young lady, and God bless her, I hope she's better today than she was then. She got up there because we in Louisiana, like Tennessee, were fighting to have the standards taken out, et cetera, et cetera. She got up to the podium and she said, if you take away the standards, I don't know how I'm going to teach second grade math. And the guy next to me put his hand on my leg because I tensed up and was ready to like jump. And I was thinking, and I leaned over and I said these words. I said, if you can't teach basic math to second graders, get out of the classroom. I'm sorry. If you need a set of standards to do your job as a teacher, then we need to look at how you're educated. We need to look at how teachers are educated. And look, I am not condemning teachers. I was one. I am still one. But we need to get real about this. And so what is it? We have social emotional learning. Common Core stripped out content. That was what my concern was about. It stripped out traditional content, and you had these lists of these vague things showing up. And so what ended up happening was, with that stripped out, you end up with a doorway for all of this stuff to move in. And then you have data, and you have all these other safe school initiatives. We can talk about that forever, what happened in Parkland in Florida. I can talk to you all day about that. But what I want to do is I want to look at, number one, here's some language. And I'm going to have to kind of fly through this because I'm running out of time. But these are some of the things that you'll hear. Equity, which is different from equality. Make them, when they say equity, make them define it. Social justice, diversity and inclusion, culturally responsive teaching and learning. Go to your State Department of Education's website, type that word in and see what comes up. Social emotional learning, that is a big key. It changes education from knowledge-based to psychological-based. Notice here the head of CASEL, which is the head of the guru of social emotional learning, says that social emotional learning is a lever for equity and social justice. They're telling you. Before they told you, no, it's just to help little Johnny be a little better little boy. Now they're telling you the reality about why they did it. Think about the Soviets. What were they doing? They were trying to change mindsets. How many of you have heard that word before? Growth mindset in the classroom. The next generation science standards, if you'll notice, equity as an expression of social justice. So your science standards, if you'll look at the top one, says that science is fundamentally a social enterprise. I agree that to an extent, but I would rather the doctor know what he's doing, okay? I don't want him to socially construct my appendix, okay? So how does it, I'm going to go ahead and go through here because you get the point. Literature and language is the key. They bring a lot of this through the English language arts. So what I want to do is show you, we got feelings, feelings, feelings. This is first grade. This is the Wit and Wisdom curriculum, which a mother in Louisiana asked me to look at. These are some of the images that they'll see in first grade, or it could be kindergarten. I think it's first grade. This is third grade, where a little mouse is contemplating what it's like to drown. Will it take long? Will it feel awful? Will his soul go to heaven?
Feelings.
Will there be other mice there? Or a story about how a pet died. I think it was a cat that died. So we're going to look at our emotions. What are they? They're sad, they're heartbroken, they're angry, upset, frustrated, annoyed, resentful. Do you notice a pattern? Okay, do you notice a pattern? And even in the teacher's manual in 5th grade, they say after an emotionally charged first module, we're going to let up on you. This is a book in, I think, 3rd grade, again from Wit and Wisdom. And in this particular book, I'm going to show you what an anchor text is as quickly as I can. An anchor text is the one text that all of the assignments rotate around. The problem with taking your child out of a particular book means that they're going to lose like 15 lessons because all of these lessons are connected to that one book. So you have this idea of an anchor text, and then all of the lessons wrap around it. In this particular test, it's about Galileo. Oh, good. Let's talk about Galileo's discovery. Well, okay, maybe. Or maybe we'll talk about how Galileo was afraid. He knew that people suffered terrible torture and punishment for not following tradition, and it could happen to him. And you see the picture of him with the church leadership surrounding him. So what happens? Well, we have a lesson on tradition in which we talk about how he's afraid, and then we do another lesson, and he's put on trial and imprisoned in his house. And another lesson, he's punished. He's in his house punished. Another lesson, he's punished. Another lesson, he's punished by the church. Church was wrong. Stars went out of his eyes. Why? Now they have to write why he was so upset. And over here, the answer. He was tried by the Pope, and the stars left his eyes. In a grammar exercise, by the way. And then at the end, the teacher's note says, in the middle, the references to the church are neutral. They do not reflect a devotion, celebratory, doctrinal acceptance of the church, nor do they reflect a critique of the modern church or religious beliefs. Now, ask yourself this question. After these multiple assignments, what do they know about Galileo?
Nothing.
Do you see? Now, let me just back up a minute. They do talk about Galileo's, in other books and in other assignments. I'll give them that. But why this and in this manner? What is, again, as a teacher, I would have in my lesson plans the rationale, and I would have my objectives. What did I want the students to know at the end of this? What do they want them to know at the end of this? I'll leave that up to you to figure that out. And so here, I'm just, again, very quickly, you've got American Indians helped the prairie, settlers hurt the prairie. American Indians took care of the grass, the settlers made problems with the buffalo. Do you see the comparison here? Same thing, over and over and over, lesson after lesson. Indians good, settlers bad. And I could go through multiple of these. You've already seen this one. This is another one. It's called George versus George, where the students in 4th grade Wit and Wisdom are going to be introduced to the words rape and murdered and tortured and killed, scalped, and cannibalism. This is in the George versus George book, which I hope the teachers said no to. I know in the district that I was in, they said no to it. So I'm going to go, again, I'm just going to kind of go very quickly through this. You get the idea. Remember the 4 things I talked about at the beginning? Family, religion, history, and language. This is from the Smithsonian Institute. And it's considered white culture to think of independence and individualism. It's white culture to have a family structure a certain way. Emphasis on scientific method is white culture. History, Protestantism, religion. Do you see the social fabric concepts? And that's the same concepts that the Soviet Union went after to change the mindsets of their children. Thank you.